Chapter 7 of David Crockett, His Life and Adventures. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brett W. Downey. David Crockett, His Life and Adventures by John S.C. Abbott. Chapter 7 The Justice of Peace and the Legislator. The wealthy and the prosperous are not disposed to leave the comforts of a high civilization for the hardships of the wilderness. Most of the pioneers who crowded to the new purchase were either energetic young men who had their fortunes to make, or families who by misfortune had encountered impoverishment. But there was still another class. There were the vile, the unprincipled, the desperate, vagabonds seeking whom they might devour, criminals escaping the penalty of the laws which they had violated. These were the men who shot down an Indian at sight, as they would shoot a wolf, merely for the fun of it, who robbed the Indian of his gun and game, burned his wigwam, and atrociously insulted his wife and daughters. These were the men whom no law could restrain, who brought disgrace upon the name of a white man, and who often provoked the ignorant savage to the most dreadful and indiscriminate retaliation. So many of these infamous men flocked to this new purchase that life there became quite undesirable. There were no legally appointed officers of peace, no organized laws. Every man did what was pleasing in his own sight. There was no collecting of debts, no redress for violence, no punishment for cheating or theft. Under these circumstances, there was a general gathering of the well-disposed inhabitants of the cabins scattered around, to adopt some measures for their mutual protection. Several men were appointed justices of peace, with a set of resolute young men as constables, to execute their commissions. These justices were invested with almost dictatorial power. They did not pretend to know anything about written law or common law. They were merely men of good sound sense, who could judge as to what was right in all ordinary intercourse between man and man. A complaint would be entered to Crockett that one man owed another money, and refused to pay him. Crockett would send his constables to arrest the man and bring him to his cabin. After hearing both parties, if Crockett judged the debt to be justly due, and that it could be paid, he would order the man's horse, cow, rifle, or any other property he owned, to be seized and sold, and the debt to be paid. If the man made any resistance, he would be very sure to have his cabin burned down over his head, and he would be very lucky if he escaped a bullet through his own body. One of the most common and annoying crimes committed by these desperadoes was shooting an emigrant's swine. These animals, regarded as so invaluable in a new country, each had its owner's mark, and ranged the woods, fattening upon acorns and other nuts. Nothing was easier than for a lazy man to wander into the woods, shoot one of these animals, take it to his cabin, devour it there, and obliterate all possible traces of the deed. Thus a large and valuable herd would gradually disappear. This crime was consequently deemed to merit the most severe punishment. It was regarded as so disgraceful that no respectable man was liable to suspicion. The punishment for the crime was very severe, and very summary. If one of these swine thieves was brought before Justice Crockett, and in his judgment the charge was proved against him, the sentence was, "Take the thief, strip off his shirt, tie him to a tree, and give him a severe flogging. Then burn down his cabin, and drive him out of the country." There was no appeal from this verdict, and no evading its execution. Such was the justice which prevailed in this remote region, until the legislature of Alabama annexed the territory to Giles County, and brought the region under the dominion of organized law. Crockett, who had performed his functions to the entire satisfaction of the community, was then legally appointed a justice of peace, and became fully entitled to the appellation of Esquire. He certainly could not then pretend to any profound legal erudition, for at this time he could neither read nor write. Esquire Crockett, commenting upon this transaction, says, "I was made a squire, according to law, though now the honor rested more heavily upon me than before. For, at first, whenever I told my constable, says I, 'Catch that fellow and bring him up for trial,' away he went, and the fellow must come, dead or alive. For we considered this a good warrant, though it was only in verbal writing. But after I was appointed by the Assembly, they told me that my warrants must be in real writing, and signed, and that I must keep a book and write my proceedings in it. This was a hard business on me, for I could just barely write my own name. But to do this, and write the warrants too, was at least a huckleberry over my persimmon. I had a pretty well informed constable, however, and he aided me very much in this business. Indeed, I told him, when he should happen to be out anywhere and see that a warrant was necessary, and would have a good effect, he needn't take the trouble to come all the way to me to get one, but he could just fill out one, and then, on the trial, I could correct the whole business if he had committed any error. In this way I got on pretty well, till, by care and attention, I improved my handwriting in such a manner as to be able to prepare my warrants and keep my record books without much difficulty. My judgments were never appealed from, and if they had been, they would have stuck like wax, as I gave my decisions on the principles of common justice and honesty between man, and relied on natural born sense, and not on law learning, to guide me, where I had never read a page in a law book in all my life." Esquire Crockett was now a rising man. He was by no means diffident. With strong native sense, imperturbable self-confidence, a memory almost miraculously stored with rude anecdotes, and an astonishing command of colloquial and slang language, he was never embarrassed, and never at a loss as to what to say or to do. They were about getting up a new regiment of militia there, and a Captain Matthews, an ambitious, well-to-do settler, with cribs full of corn, was a candidate for the colonelship. He came to Crockett to ensure his support, and endeavored to animate him to more cordial cooperation by promising to do what he could to have him elected major of the regiment. Esquire Crockett at first declined, saying that he was thoroughly disgusted with all military operations, and that he had no desire for any such honors. But as Captain Matthews urged the question, and Crockett reflected that the office would give him some additional respect and influence with his neighbors, and that Major Crockett was a very pleasantly sounding title, he finally consented, and, of course, very soon became deeply interested in the enterprise. Captain Matthews, as an electioneering measure, invited all his neighbors, far and near, to a very magnificent corn-husking frolic. There was to be a great treat on the occasion, and "all the world," as the French would say, were eager to be there. Crockett and his family were of course among the invited guests. When Crockett got there he found an immense gathering, all in high glee, and was informed, much to his surprise and chagrin, that Captain Matthews' son had offered himself for the office of major, in opposition to Crockett. The post had, in reality, but few charms for Crockett, and he did not care much for it. But this unworthy treatment roused his indignation. He was by nature one of the most frank and open-hearted of men, and never attempted to do anything by guile. Immediately he called Captain Matthews aside, and inquired what this all meant. The captain was much embarrassed, and made many lame excuses, saying that he would rather his son would run against any man in the county than against Squire Crockett. "You need give yourself no uneasiness about that," Crockett replied. "I care nothing for the office of major. I shall not allow my name to be used against your son for that office. But I shall do everything in my power to prevent his father from being colonel." In accordance with the custom of the region and the times, after the feasting and the frolicking, Captain Matthews mounted a stump, and addressed the assembly in what was appropriately called a stump speech, advocating his election. The moment he closed, Squire Crockett mounted the stump, and on the captain's own grounds, addressing the captain's guests, and himself one of those guests, totally unabashed, made his first stump speech. He was at no loss for words or ideas. He was full to the brim of fun. He could, without any effort, keep the whole assembly in roars of laughter. And there, in the presence of Captain Matthews and his family, he argued his total unfitness to be commander of the regiment. It is to be regretted that there was no reporter present to transmit to us that speech. It must have been a peculiar performance. It certainly added much to Crockett's reputation as an able man and an orator. When the election came, both father and son were badly beaten. Soon after, a committee waited upon Crockett, soliciting him to stand as candidate for the state legislature to represent the two counties of Lawrence and Hickman. Crockett was beginning to be ambitious. He consented. But he had already engaged to take a drove of horses from central Tennessee to the lower part of North Carolina. This was a long journey, and going and coming would take 3 months. He set out early in March, 1821. Upon his return in June, he commenced, with all zeal, his electioneering campaign. Characteristically, he says, "It was a bran fire new business to me. It now became necessary that I should tell the people something about the government, and an eternal sight of other things that I knowed nothing more about than I did about Latin, and law, and such things as that. I have said before, that in those days none of us called General Jackson the government. But I knowed so little about it that if anyone had told me that he was the government, I should have believed it, for I had never read even a newspaper in my life, or anything else on the subject. Lawrence County bounded Giles County on the west. Just north of Lawrence came Hickman County. Crockett first directed his steps to Hickman County, to engage in his bran fire new work of electioneering for himself as a candidate for the legislature. What ensued cannot be more graphically told than in Crockett's own language. Here they told me that they wanted to move their town nearer to the center of the county, and I must come out in favor of it. There's no devil if I'd knowed what this meant, or how the town was to be moved, and so I kept dark, going on the identical same plan that I now find is called non-committal. About this time there was a great squirrel hunt on the Duck River, which was among my people. They were to hunt 2 days, then to meet and count the scalps, and have a big barbecue, and what might be called a tip-top country frolic. The dinners and a general treat was all to be paid for by the party having taken the fewest scalps. I joined one side, and got a gun ready for the hunt. I killed a great many squirrels, and when we counted scalps, my party was victorious. The company had everything to eat and drink that could be furnished in a new country, and much fun and good humor prevailed. But before the regular frolic commenced, I was called on to make a speech as a candidate, which was a business I was as ignorant of as an outlandish negro. A public document I had never seen. How to begin I couldn't tell. I made many apologies, and tried to get off, for I'd knowed I had a man to run against who could speak prime. And I'd knowed, too, that I wasn't able to cut and thrust with him. He was there, and knowing my ignorance as well as I did myself, he urged me to make a speech. The truth is, he thought my being a candidate was a mere matter of sport, and didn't think for a moment that he was in any danger from an ignorant backwoods bear hunter. But I found I couldn't get off, so I determined to go ahead, and leave it to chance what I should say. I got up and told the people I reckoned they'd knowed what I had come for, but if not, I could tell them. I had come for their votes, and if they didn't watch mighty close, I'd get them too. But the worst of all was, that I could not tell them anything about government. I tried to speak about something, and I cared very little what, until I choked up as bad as if my mouth had been jammed and crammed chock full of dry mush. There the people stood, listening all the while, with their eyes, mouths, and ears all open to catch every word I could speak. At last I told them that I was like a fellow I had heard of not long before. He was beating on the head of an empty barrel on the roadside, when a traveller, who was passing along, asked him what he was doing that for. The fellow replied that there was some cider in that barrel a few days before, and he was trying to see if there was any then, but if there was, he couldn't get at it. I told them that there had been a little bit of speech in me a while ago, but I believed I couldn't get it out. They all roared out in a mighty laugh, and I told some other anecdotes, equally amusing to them, and believing I had them in a first-rate way, I quit, and got down, thanking the people for their attention. But I took care to remark that I was as dry as a powder horn, and that I thought it was time for us to all wet our whistles a little. And so I put off to a liquor stand, and was followed by the greater part of the crowd. I felt certain this was necessary, for I knowed my competitor could talk government matters to them as easy as he pleased. He had, however, mighty few left to hear him, as I continued with the crowd, now and then taking a horn, and telling good-humored stories till he was done speaking. I found I was good for the votes at the hunt, and when we broke up I went on to the town of Vernon, which was the same they wanted me to move. Here they pressed me again on the subject. I found I could get either party by agreeing with them, but I told them I didn't know whether it would be right or not, and so couldn't promise either way. This famous barbecue was on Saturday. The next Monday the county court held its session at Vernon. There was a great gathering of the pioneers from all the parts of the county. The candidates for the governor of the state, for a representative in Congress, and for the state legislature were all present. Some of these men were of considerable ability, and certainly of very fluent speech. The backwoodsmen, from their huts, where there was no books, no newspapers, no intelligent companionship, found this a rich intellectual treat. Their minds were greatly excited as they listened to the impassioned and glowing utterances of speaker after speaker, for many of these stump orators had command of a rude but very effective eloquence. Crockett listened also, with increasing anxiety. He knew that his turn was to come, and that he must mount the stump and address the listening throng. He perceived that he could not speak as these men were speaking, and perhaps for the first time in his life began to experience some sense of inferiority. He writes, "The thought of having to make a speech made my knees feel mighty weak, and set my heart to fluttering almost as bad as my first love scrape with the Quaker's niece. But as good luck would have it, these big candidates spoke nearly all day, and when they quit, the people were worn out with fatigue, which afforded me a good apology for not discussing the government. But I listened mighty close to them, and was learning pretty fast about political matters. When they were all done, I got up and told some laughable story and quit. I found I was safe in those parts, and so I went home, and did not go back again till after the election was over. But, to cut this matter short, I was elected, doubling my competitor, and 9 votes over. A short time after this, I was at Pulaski, where I met with Colonel Polk, now a member of Congress from Tennessee. He was at that time a member elected to the legislature, as well as myself. In a large company he said to me, "Well, Colonel, I suppose we shall have a radical change of the judiciary at the next session of the legislature." "Very likely, sir," says I, and I put out quicker, for I was afraid someone would ask me what the judiciary was, and if I knowed I wish I may be shot. I don't indeed believe I had ever before heard that there was any such thing in all nature, but still I was not willing that the people there should know how ignorant I was about it. At length the day arrived for the meeting of the legislature. Crockett repaired to the seat of government. With all his self-complacency, he began to appreciate that he had much to learn. The 2 first items of intelligence which he deemed it important that he, as a member of the legislature, should acquire, were the meaning of the words government and judiciary. By adroit questioning and fixed thought, he ere long stored up those intellectual treasures. Though with but little capacity to obtain knowledge from books, he became an earnest student of the ideas of his fellow legislators, as elicited in conversation or debate. Quite a heavy disaster, just at this time, came upon Crockett. We must again quote his own words, for it is our wish, in this volume, to give the reader a correct idea of the man. Whatever Crockett says, ever comes fresh from his heart. He writes, "About this time I met with a very severe misfortune, which I may be pardoned for naming, as it made a great change in my circumstances, and kept me back very much in the world. I had built an extensive grist mill and powder mill, all connected together, and also a large distillery. They had cost me upward of $3,000, more than I was worth in the world. The first news that I heard, after I got to the legislature, was that my mills were all swept to smash by a large freshet that came soon after I left home. I had, of course, to stop my distillery, as my grinding was broken up, and indeed I may say that the misfortune just made a complete mash of me. I had some likely negroes, and a good stock of almost everything about me, and best of all, I had an honest wife. She didn't advise me, as is too fashionable, to smuggle up this and that and t'other to go on at home, but she told me, she says, just pay up as long as you have a bit's worth in the world, and then everybody will be satisfied, and we will scuffle for more. This was just such talk as I wanted to hear, for a man's wife can hold him devilish uneasy if she begins to scold and fret and perplex him, at a time when he has a full load for a railroad car on his mind already. And so, you see, I had determined not to break full-handed, but thought it better to keep a good conscience with an empty purse than to get a bad opinion of myself with a full one. I therefore gave up all I had and took a brand-fire new start." Crockett's legislative career was by no means brilliant, but characteristic. He was the fun-maker of the House, and, like Falstaff, could boast that he was not only witty himself, but the cause of wit in others. His stories were irresistibly comic, but they almost always contained expressions of profanity or coarseness which renders it impossible for us to transmit them to these pages. He was an inimitable mimic, and had perfect command of a Dutchman's brogue. One of the least objectionable of his humorous stories we will venture to record. There were, he said, in Virginia, 2 Dutchmen, brothers, George and Jake Fulwiler. They were both well-to-do in the world, and each owned a grist mill. There was another Dutchman near by the name of Henry Schneider. He was a monomaniac, but a harmless man, occasionally thinking himself to be God. He built a throne, and would often sit upon it, pronouncing judgment upon others, and also upon himself. He would send the culprits to heaven or to hell, as his humor prompted. One day he had a little difficulty with the 2 Fulwilers. He took his seat upon his throne, and in imagination summoning the culprits before him, thus addressed them: "Shorge Fulwiler, stand up. What hash you been dane in dis lower world?" "Ach, Lort, Ach, don't know. Well, George Fulwiler, hasn't you got a mill? Yes, Lorch, it has. Well, George Fulwiler, didn't you never take too much toll? Yes, Lorch, it has. When der water was slow, and mine stones was dull, it takes little too much toll. Well then, George Fulwiler, you must go to der left, mit der goats. Well, Shake Fulwiler, now you stand up. What has you been doing in this lower world? Ach, Lord, ich does not know. Well, Shake Fulwiler, hasn't you got a mill? Yes, Lord, it has. Well, Shake Fulwiler, hasn't you never taken too much toll? Yes, Lord, it has. When der water was slow, and mine stones was dull, it take little too much toll. Well then, Shake Fulwiler, you must go to der left, mit der goats. Now it's try myself. Henry Schneider. Henry Schneider, stand up. What has you been doing in der lower world? Ach, Lord, ich does not know. Well, Henry Schneider, hasn't you got a mill? Yes, Lord, it has. Well, Henry Schneider, didn't you never take too much toll? Yes, Lord, it has. When der water was slow, and mine stones was dull, it has taken little too much toll. But, Henry Schneider, what did you do mit der toll? Ach, Lord, it gives it to the poor. The judge paused a moment, and then said, Well, Henry Schneider, you must go to the right, mit der sheep, but it is a tight squeeze. Another specimen of his more sober forensic eloquence is to be found in the following speech. There was a bill before the House for a creation of a new county, and there was a dispute about the boundary line. The author of the bill wished to run the line in a direction which would manifestly promote his own interest. Crockett arose and said, Mr. Speaker, do you know what that man's bill reminds me of? Well, I suppose you don't, so I'll tell you. Well, Mr. Speaker, when I first came to this country, a blacksmith was a rare thing, but there happened to be one in my neighborhood. He had no striker, and whenever one of his neighbors wanted any work done, he had to go over and strike until his work was finished. These were hard times, Mr. Speaker, but we had to do the best we could. It happened that one of my neighbors wanted an axe, so he took along with him a piece of iron, and went over to the blacksmith's to strike till his axe was done. The iron was heated, and my neighbor fell to work, and was striking there nearly all day, when the blacksmith concluded that the iron wouldn't make an axe, but would make a fine mattock. So my neighbor, wanting a mattock, concluded that he would go over and strike till the mattock was done. Accordingly he went over the next day and worked faithfully. But towards night the blacksmith concluded his iron wouldn't make a mattock, but would make a fine plowshare. So my neighbor, wanting a plowshare, agreed that he would go over the next day and strike till that was done. Accordingly he went over, and fell hard at work. But towards night the blacksmith concluded his iron wouldn't make a plowshare, but would make a fine scow. So my neighbor, tired of working, cried, A scow let it be! And the blacksmith, taking up the red-hot iron, threw it into a trough of hot water near him, and as it fell, it sung out scow. And this, Mr. Speaker, will be the way of that man's bill for a county. He'll keep you all here, doing nothing, and finally his bill will turn up a scow. Now mind if it don't. At this time, Crockett, by way of courtesy, was usually called Colonel. As with us almost every respectable man takes the title of Esquire. One of the members offended Colonel Crockett by speaking disrespectfully of him as from the backwoods, or, as he expressed it, the gentleman from the cane. Crockett made a very bungling answer, which did not satisfy himself. After the House adjourned, he very pleasantly invited the gentleman to take a walk with him. They chatted very sociably by the way, till at the distance of about a mile they reached a very secluded spot, when the Colonel, turning to his opponent, said, Do you know what I brought you here for? No, was the reply. Well, added the Colonel, I brought you here for the express purpose of whipping you, and now I mean to do it. But, says the Colonel, in recording the event, the fellow said he didn't mean anything, and kept apologizing till I got into good humor. They walked back as good friends as ever, and no one but themselves knew of the affair. After the adjournment of the legislature, Crockett returned to his impoverished home. The pecuniary losses he had encountered induced him to make another move, and one for which it is difficult to conceive of any adequate motive. He took his eldest son, a boy about 8 years of age, and a young man by the name of Abram Henry, and with one pack horse to carry their blankets and provisions, plunged into the vast wilderness west of them on an exploring tour in search of a new home. Crockett and the young man shouldered their rifles. Day after day the three trudged along, fording streams, clambering hills, wading morasses, and threading ravines, each night constructing a frail shelter, cooking by their campfire such game as they had taken by the way. After traversing these almost pathless wilds 150 miles, and having advanced nearly 50 miles beyond any white settlement, they reached the banks of a lonely stream called Obion River, on the extreme western frontier of Tennessee. This river emptied into the Mississippi but a few miles from the spot where Crockett decided to rear his cabin. His nearest neighbor was 7 miles distant, his next 15, his next 20. About 10 years before, that whole region had been convulsed by one of the most terrible earthquakes recorded in history. One or two awful hurricanes had followed the earthquake, prostrating the gigantic forest, and scattering the trees in all directions. Appalling indications remained of the power expended by these tremendous forces of nature. The largest forest trees were found split from their roots to their tops, and lying half on each side of a deep fissure. The opening abysses, the entanglement of the prostrate forest, and the dense underbrush which had sprung up, rendered the whole region almost impenetrable. The country was almost entirely uninhabited. It had, however, become quite celebrated as being the best hunting ground in the West. The fear of earthquakes and the general desolation had prevented even the Indians from rearing their wigwams there. Consequently, wild animals had greatly increased. The country was filled with bears, wolves, panthers, deer, elks, and other smaller game. The Indians had recently made this discovery, and were, in ever increasing numbers, exploring the regions in hunting bands. Crockett does not seem to have had much appreciation of the beautiful. In selecting a spot for his hut, he wished to be near some crystal stream where he could get water, and to build his hut upon land sufficiently high to be above the reach of freshets. It was also desirable to find a small plain or meadow free from trees, where he could plant his corn, and to be in the edge of the forest, which would supply him with abundance of fuel. Crockett found such a place, exactly to his mind. Being very fond of hunting, he was the happiest of men. A few hours' labor threw up a rude hut, which was all the home he desired. His rifle furnished him with food, and with the skins of animals for bed and bedding. Every frontiersman knew how to dress the skin of deer for moccasins and other garments. With a sharpened stick he punched holes through the rank sod, and planted corn, in soil so rich that it would return him several hundredfold. Thus his tastes, such as they were gratified, and he enjoyed what to him were life's luxuries. He probably would not have been willing to exchange places with the resident in the most costly mansion in our great cities. In a few days he got everything comfortable around him. Crockett's cabin, or rather camp, was on the eastern side of the Obion River. 7 miles farther up the stream, on the western bank, a Mr. Owen had reared his log house. One morning, Crockett, taking the young man Henry and his son with him, set out to visit Mr. Owen, his nearest neighbor. He hobbled his horse, leaving him to graze until he got back. They followed along the banks of the river, through the forest, until they reached a point nearly opposite Owen's cabin. By crossing the stream there, and following up the western bank, they would be sure to find his hut. There was no boat, and the stream must be swum or forded. Recent rains had caused it to overflow its banks, and spread widely over the marshy bottoms and low country near by. The water was icy cold, and yet they took to it, says Crockett, like so many beavers. The expanse to be crossed was very wide, and they knew not how deep they should find the channel. For some distance the water continued quite shoal. Gradually it deepened. Crockett led the way with a pole in his hand. Cautiously he sounded the depth before him, lest they should fall into any slough. A dense growth of young trees covered the inundated bottom over which they were wading. Occasionally they came to a deep but narrow gully. Crockett, with his hatchet, would cut down a small tree, and by its aid would cross. At length the water became so deep that Crockett's little boy had to swim, though they evidently had not yet reached the channel of the stream. Having waded nearly half a mile, they came to the channel. The stream, with its natural banks, was but about 40 feet wide. Large forest trees fringed the shores. One immense tree, blown down by the wind, reached about halfway across. Crockett, with very arduous labor with his hatchet, cut down another, so that it fell with the branches of the two intertwining. Thus aided, they reached the opposite side. But still the lowlands beyond were overflowed as far as the eye could see through the dense forest. On they waded, for nearly a mile, when, to their great joy, they came in sight of dry land. Their garments were dripping, and they were severely chilled as they reached the shore. But turning their steps up the stream, they soon came in sight of the cabin, which looked to them like a paradise of rest. It was one of the rudest of huts. The fenceless grounds around were rough and ungainly. The dismal forest, which chanced there to have escaped both earthquake and hurricane, spread apparently without limits in all directions. Most men, most women, gazing upon a scene so wild, lonely, cheerless, would have said, "Let me sink into the grave rather than be doomed to such a home as that." But to Crockett and his companions it presented all the attractions their hearts could desire. Mr. Owen and several other men were just starting away from the cabin, when, to their surprise, they saw the party of strangers approaching. They waited until Crockett came up and introduced himself. The men with Mr. Owen were boatmen, who had entered the Obion River from the Mississippi with a boatload of articles for trade. They were just leaving to continue their voyage. Such men are seldom in a hurry. Time is to them of but very little value. Hospitality was a virtue which cost nothing. Any stranger, with his rifle, could easily pay his way in the procurement of food. They all turned back and entered the cabin together. Mrs. Owen was an excellent, motherly woman about 50 years of age. Her sympathies were immediately excited for the poor little boy, whose garments were drenched, and who was shivering as if in an ague fit. She replenished the fire, dried his clothes, and gave him some warm and nourishing food. The grateful father writes, "Her kindness to my little boy did me 10 times as much good as anything she could have done for me, if she had tried her best." These were not the days of temperance. The whiskey bottle was considered one of the indispensables of every log cabin which made any pretenses to gentility. The boat, moored near the shore, was loaded with whiskey, flour, sugar, hardware, and other articles, valuable in the Indian trade in the purchase of furs, and in great demand in the huts of pioneers. There was a small trading post at what was called McLemon's Bluff, about 30 miles farther up the river by land, and nearly 100 in following the windings of the stream. This point the boatmen were endeavoring to reach. For landing their cargo at this point, the boatmen were to receive $500, besides the profits of any articles they could sell in the scattered hamlets they might encounter by the way. The whiskey bottle was of course brought out. Crockett drank deeply, he says at least half a pint. His tongue was unloosed, and he became one of the most voluble and entertaining of men. His clothes having been dried by the fire, and all having with boisterous merriment partaken of a hearty supper, as night came on the little boy was left to the tender care of Mrs. Owen, while the rest of the party repaired to the cabin of the boat to make a night of it in drinking and carousal. They had indeed a wild time. There was whiskey in abundance. Crockett was in his element, and kept the whole company in a constant roar. Their shouts and bacchanal songs resounded through the solitudes, with clamor and profaneness which must have fallen painfully upon angels' ears if any of heaven's pure and gentle spirits were within hearing distance. "We had," writes Crockett, "a high night of it, as I took steam enough to drive out all the cold that was in me, and about 3 times as much more." These boon companions became warm friends, according to the most approved style of backwoods friendship. Mr. Owen told the boatman that a few miles farther up the river a hurricane had entirely prostrated the forest, and that the gigantic trees so encumbered the stream that he was doubtful whether the boat would pass, unless the water should rise higher. Consequently he, with Crockett and Henry, accompanied the boatmen up to that point to help them through, should it be possible to effect a passage. But it was found impossible, and the boat dropped down again to its moorings opposite Mr. Owen's cabin. As it was now necessary to wait till the river should rise, the boatman and Mr. Owen all consented to accompany Crockett to the place where he was to settle, and build his house for him. It seems very strange that, in that dismal wilderness, Crockett should not have preferred to build his cabin near so kind a neighbor. But so it was. He chose his lot at a distance of 7 miles from any companionship. "And so I got the boatman," he writes, "all to go out with me to where I was going to settle, and we slipped up a cabin in little or no time. I got from the boat 4 barrels of meal, 1 of salt, and about 10 gallons of whiskey." For these he paid in labor, agreeing to accompany the boatmen up the river as far as their landing place at McLemon's Bluff. End of chapter. Recording by Brett Downey.